Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yoma Daf Yud. Today's daf is sponsored by Ellen Golub in loving memory of her aunt, Lottie Cohen, on her 7th yahrzeit. Aunt Lottie spoke a beautiful Yiddish and was a woman of extraordinary patience, love, and generosity of spirit. Yehi Zichrona Livracha. And by Yoni Bach to his partner Ron Kaplan on achieving a half-century milestone. From never having studied a page of Talmud to taking time to tackle Daf Yomi daily, you're an inspiration. Happy birthday. Amea V'Esrim. And for Refuah Shlema for Noach Avraham ben Bat Yashana. Okay, we have an interesting start to our daf, a little bit atypical. We started yesterday, we were talking about this machloket, Rabbi Yochanan v'Rish Lakish, about was the reason why there was no divine presence in the Second Temple. Was it because the Jews didn't make Aliyah based on Rish Lakish? They didn't all come back in the time of Ezra, and that was the problem. Or according to Rabbi Yochanan, that wasn't the issue at all. The issue was that the temple was built also by the Persians. Okay, recommended reading for today, if you didn't see it yesterday, Shuli Mishkan's article on Flashback is all about the issue of the comparison of the two batim, which was better, which was worse, etc. So here we get that clearly there was something in Bayit Sheni that was different, which was it was built also by the Persians, right? They both permitted it and they were somewhat involved in the building, and therefore that put it in a different place than Bayit Rishon, which was built by Shlomo and obviously his people. So now they want to know, since we've mentioned that the Persians, and they prove it from this pasuk about Yafta Lehim Yefet Yishkom Ba'alei Shem, right? That God is going to end up dwelling only in the tent of Shem, not anything that has to do with Yefet. So now we're going to say, how do we know? The assumption is that the Persians came from Yefet. How do we know that, right? These are the sons of Noach. So how do we know that they came from Yefet? Parsai, we're on line number 2 in our daf. Parsai menalan de Yefet ka'atu. How do we know that they came from Yefet? From this, we're going to get off on a big tangent for a little while about the different names in the book of Breshit and what they're referencing, all the sons of and who they are and what nation or what location they're living in today. So I just want to point out, if you are using Steinsaltz or Schottenstein and each one tries to give you an explanation, this is a good example of once you have commentary, right, and you read it's a commentary or translation, it makes you think that that's the only opinion, but there's many varied opinions about where these locations are. In general, when it comes to issues like whether it's botany or whether it's geography, in general, I'm not going to say which one's more correct, but in general, part of what Rav Steinsaltz wanted to do when he made his commentary, one of his main goals was to try to identify from a scientific perspective, and he consulted with botanists and people who were involved in geography of the land, of everywhere, to try to figure out in a more scientific method what these locations were. Whereas the Schottenstein will more side with the commentaries and what the commentaries say. Whereas on issues like this, Rav Steinsaltz said, no, I want to consult with experts in these fields. So therefore, I'm going to go with his interpretations. Again, I'm not saying one is right or wrong necessarily, but it seems to me that would be more the way to go. So I'll use his commentary when we want to identify where these locations are. So now we're going to say, Dichtiv B'nai Yefet. Here's a list of who the B'nai Yefet were. Gomer, Umagog, Umadai, Yavam, Betuval, Umeshach, Betiras. These are the sons of Yefet that are listed in Sefer Breshit, okay, where it lists all the genealogies. Gomer ze Germania. Okay, this is Germania, which, okay, I'll give you one where there's a big difference of opinion between them. So the Gra says it's Germania, and based on that, the Schottenstein says it's Germania, the art scroll. But in the Koran, they say it's Garaminia, which is in northern Assyria, okay, which is totally different than Germany, right? It doesn't make so much sense. They would call it, nobody really called it Germany at that time. Generally, right, we call it always Ashkenaz when we talk about the Yemei Beinaim. I assume before that also it wasn't really called Germania. So this seems like a stronger interpretation, again, based on what's known from a scientific perspective, or not scientific exactly, but geography. Next, Magog Zo Kandia. So in the Koran, they say Kandia is other commentary or other books, manuscripts have it as Gutia, which makes more sense. It's referring to the Goths in Asia Minor. Madai, Zo Macedonia. Yavan, Kimashma'o, that's okay, Greece, we know that. Tuval, Ze Beit Unaiki, which is Bithynia region in Asia Minor. Meshech zo Musia, okay, which is Moesia, which is north of Thrace, which we're going to get to in a minute. And Thrace was in northern Greece, so it's around there. Tiras, right? We're basically going between the Greece area and Asia Minor area. There's maps, by the way, in both the Schottenstein and in the Steinsaltz, the Koren. Meshech, zo Musia, so we just read that. Tiras. Now we finally get to the last son, Tiras. Who is Tiras? Pligira Rabbi Simai Rabbanan. There's a machloket between Rabbi Simai and the rabbis, or Amrela. Some people say it was a machloket between Rabbi Simon and Rabbanan. Okay, there's a debate about the debate. There's a debate whether Rabbi Simon or Rabbi Simai was the one who disagreed with the rabbis about this. And not only is that not known who exactly it was, but it's not known who said what. Chad Amar, one said Zo Beit Traiki, which is Thrace, which is in northern Greece. The Chad Amar Zo Paras. The other one said this is Persia. There we have it. We were looking for Paras came from Yefet. At least according to one opinion, this is where you get it from. Tana Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef also brought a braita that said Tiras zo Paras. Tiras is Paras. Maybe, by the way, the letters are similar other than the Taf and the Pei, but the Resh Samach are the same. And they say this is Paras. Okay, now we're continuing with other verses in that chapter of Breshit. It's in chapter 10. Ubnei Kush. Okay, the sons of Kush. And of the sons of Kush, we have Safta v'Rama v'Saftecha. Tani Rav Yosef, and this is probably why we're bringing it, because Rav Yosef brought a braita about Persia. Now he's going to bring a braita about other places. Sakistan, Gaziata v'Sakistan braita. There's Sakistan, the inner Sakistan, and the outer Sakistan. What is Sakistan? It sounds like, and right, there's all the Stanim, all those countries. So they say it's Afghanistan, it's southern Afghanistan, and it borders on eastern Iran. Okay, that's the places that we're talking about here on the inside and the outside. Bein chada l'chada, between the two of them are mea parsai. Okay, parsaot are between like 3.6, I think, of 4.5, or somewhere around 3 point something and 4 point something kilometers. So multiply by 100, that's the distance between them. So 300 to 400 kilometers. Bekefa alpha parsai, and the perimeter is 1,000 parsaot between these two, right, around these two countries. Okay, we're continuing along in those verses there. What are these places? Bavel, okay, these are all going to be near Babylonia by the Tigris and the Euphrates. So we have Bavel, Kemashma'a, okay, we know what Bavel is. Erech zo Orichut, which is another city over there. Akkad zo Bashkal, Kalana zo Nofar Ninfi. Okay, these places actually aren't really described in the Koran as exactly where they are. Mina aretzahu yatsa Ashur. From this land, when Ashur went out, okay, which we're going to see. Tani Rav Yosef Ashur is this Silak, which seems to be a city in Assyria. The Ashur could be a city and it could be a country. Rashi on the Torah says Ashur is a person, and in fact, if you look at Rashi here, it says Mina aretzahi yatsa. It's Rashi about 7 lines down from the top of the daf. Shelo lihiyot ba'atzat dor haflaga. This is a very interesting line. Rashi says, why did Mina Aretz Hahi Yatsa Ashur? Why did Ashur go out? Ashur went out in order to make sure not to be involved, like they saw what was coming, because what comes after this is Dor Haflaga, when they tried to build the Tower of Babel. So basically, he got out of there to not be involved in that. It's an interesting commentary here. It certainly doesn't say that in the Gemara, but that's what Rashi's darshaning here. Even at Ninveh, ve'et Chavot Ir ve'et Kalach. So Ninveh kemashma'o. We know Ninveh from the Yonah story. Rechovot Ir zo Prat Meshan. That's on the Euphrates. Prat is the Euphrates. It's Meshan, which was on the Euphrates. Kalach zo Prat de Borsif. Borsif and Meshan come up a lot in the Gemara. We've seen them before. So this is Borsif that sits on the Euphrates. There was some sugya, I can't remember exactly the details. Bavel is Borsif, Borsif is Bavel. There was something about that we had at some point. We're continuing in this verse. We're in Breshit, Perek, chapter 10, verse 12. So then it says, Resen is between Ninveh and Kelach. She is the big city. So the pshat of this pasuk is that Resen is a big city and it's situated in between Kalach and Ninveh. So first the Gemara says Resen. What is Resen? Zo Aktisfon. Okay, that's this place called Aktisfon, which is on the Chidekel, on the Tigris. Then it says Hi Ha'ir Agdola. So it says here Ein Yodea Im Ninveh Ha'ir Agdola Im Resen Ha'ir Agdola. Well, when it says Hi Ha'ir Agdola, what does this mean? Are we talking about is Resen the big city? Or is it talking about Nineveh, that's the big city? Now, you might say, it's pretty obvious, it's Resen, that's what the verse is saying. Why are you even suggesting it would be otherwise? But from the answer, you're going to see why they suggested this. Now, this is a good example of where, right, what I mentioned is that when you look in the art scroll, the Schottenstein, they use commentaries to come up with their definitions of where these places are, whereas the Koren and Rav Steinsaltz use scientific evidence, whatever evidence he could find. Here also, it's very interesting when they want to know whether Nineveh was the big city or Resen was the big city, where does the Gemara look to? Other verses in the Torah to try to find proof. So what do they see? Well, in Sefer Yona, where it talks about Nineveh, it says Nineveh haitat ir gdola le'elohim alach shel yamim. Nineveh was a big city. So here you have it. Oh, when it says Nineveh was a big city in Sefer Yona, and it says something about a big city near Nineveh, in the context of Nineveh in Bereshit, it must have been referring to Nineveh. Havei omer, Nineveh hi ha'ir hagdola. So it's saying Resen is situated between Nineveh and Kalach, and Nineveh is the big city, just so you know. That's identifying Nineveh. So it's somewhat against the pshat of that pasuk. I just recommended, I didn't have a chance to do this, I wanted to, but to look up English translation of that pasuk and see how the simple reading of that pasuk is translated in different commentaries. Do they translate it that Resen is the big city, or do they translate it that it's Nineveh? It would just be interesting to see. Okay, now we're getting to the giants that are mentioned in the story of the spies. If you remember, the spies go and they say, oh, we saw, they went to and then this is even before they even say what they saw, but when they get to Hebron, Sham Achiman Sheshai v'Tamai Yelidei Ha'anak, right? They see there these giants. So how did we get to this? Because we're darshaning names in the Torah. So once we're darshaning names, let's darshan some more names. So now they bring up right Tana Achiman miyuman sheba'achim. He was the strongest and the best of all the brothers. Sheshai, they're darshaning the name Achiman from miyuman, which by the way comes from Yamin. Right is always considered the stronger. Sheshai shemisim et haaretz kishchitot. He made ditches in the ground. So here, someone who walks and is so gigantic that when they walk in the ground, they make ditches by walking in the ground. So that's Sheshai. Some people say this doesn't really seem to connect so well between the word Sheshai and Shchitot. It's not exactly a great drasha. There's different girsa that actually says it's Shayish, marble, that he was so strong and heavy like marble. Talmai shemisim ta'aretz tlamim. He made the land furrows when he walked. Again, showing how big and heavy he was. Some people have the word davar acher. Some people say get rid of it because it's not really davar acher. Davar acher would mean we're darshaning their names in a different manner. But this is saying no, just another thing about them. Achimam bana anat, Sheshai bana alush, Talmai bana talbush. Different places that they each built. Yelidei ha'anak, continuing to darshan that verse. The sons of the giant. What does it mean? Shema'anikim hachama b'komatan. They're so gigantic that the sun looks like it's an adornment on them. It looks like a necklace, like an anidah. It's a necklace on them because they're so tall. It looks like, the appearances. Right? That's kind of saying how out of this world they are. Okay, so that was all. We got off on a tangent. We're still on this tangent about the Parsim, which we mentioned that they were involved in the building of the temple. But now the Gemara wants to talk about, well, what's going to happen to the Persians and the Romans? Those are the two main rulers at the time of the Gemara. And they want to know who's going to destroy who. So we're going to have two opinions like everything else. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Amar Rebbe. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says in the name of Rebbe, Atida Romi Shetipol Biyad Paras. In the end, the Persians are going to conquer the Romans. Shenema, as it says in a verse in Yirmiyahu, Lachin shim'u atzat Hashem asher ya'atz el Edom. This is what God said is going to happen to Edom, which is the Romans. Umachshavotav asher chashav el yoshvei Teman, and also for those living in Teman, in Yemen. Im lo yischevum tzirei hatzon, if they won't be wiped out by the young sheep or the young of the tzon family, right? The sheep, lambs, goats, all that. So okay, im lo yasim alehem nivehem. So now he's assuming that tzirei hatzon are a reference to the Persians. So we're basically saying the Romans are going to be wiped out by the Persians, that you see from this pasuk in Yirmiyahu. That was said by Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi in the name of Rebbe. Matkifla Rabba Bar Ula. Rabba Bar Ula says, "My mashma dehait tzirei atzon parasuv." Where did you get this? That the tzirei atzon are Persians. Dichtiv. Did you get it from here? And if so, I'm going to counter question you. In Sefer Daniel, the book of Daniel, there's a whole description of this dream, this vision that Daniel sees. He has a dream, and in it there's a reference. There's these 4 animals, which are references to the 4 kingdoms that were ruling, and kind of who's going to override who, etc. So it says there, the ram that you saw that has horns, those are the kings of Madai and Paras. So is that who you think, who you're talking about here? Is that the one you're referring to? That's the Malchei Madai. And you're saying the Ayil, which comes from the Tzon family. So is that what you mean? And that's how you know it's Paras. But Ema Yavan. Why don't you say Yavan? Because Dichtiv Atzafir Hasair Melech Yavan. It says there also in Daniel that the Seir, the goat, is referencing the king of Greece. So you have 2 different Tzon. One is Greece and one is Persia. So how do you know that that's the Tzirei Hatzon that's referenced here? Tzirei Hatzon is Persia. So that's his question. Kisalak Rav Chaviva bar Surmaki, when he went up to Israel, Amra Kameh Daume Rabbanit, he said the exact question that Rabba Bar Ula asked. He said it to a rabbi, a particular rabbi. Amarle, so that rabbi says to him, Mandelo Yada Perushekha Motiv Tiyuv Rebbe. Someone who doesn't know how to read simple reading of a verse is questioning Rebbe. And as Rebbe said, Tzirei Hatzon is Persia. And you can't even read a simple pasuk, and you're questioning. Now, why can't you read a simple pasuk? Because he says, "My tzirei hatzon." What does tzirei hatzon mean? It means zutra da'achoi, the youngest of the brothers. Now, where did we start today? We had a whole list of Yefet's sons, and the last one, Tiras, we said was Paras. Tzirei hatzon means the youngest of the sons of Yefet. Titane Rav Yosef Tiras Paras, and as Rav Yosef says, Tiras is Paras. That's how we get to this, and that's how we know. And therefore, I don't know why you're asking your question. It has nothing to do with Daniel. The Tzirei Hatzon just means the youngest of the brothers. Okay, that's one approach. And we're going to see a little bit more about this approach, that the Romans are going to fall in the hands of the Persians. That's the famous Rabbi Yehuda that we always quote in the Mishnah. The Romans are going to ultimately fall in the hands of Paras. So not only Rebbe said this, also Rabbi Yehuda said. Kal v'chomer, but he says, I'm not going to learn it from a verse. I'm going to learn it from a simple kal v'chomer. Uma mikdash rishon shebena'u b'nei Shem. Again, going back to what we started with. The first temple was built solely by Jews. V'chrivu kastim, who destroyed it? The Babylonians, the kastim. They're also called kastim. Naflu kastim, the Babylonians fell biyad parsim, in the hands of the Persians. So the Persians destroyed the Babylonians, who destroyed our temple that was built by us. So here comes the Kavachomer. Mikdash sheni shebena'u parsiim v'irchivu Romiyim. So if the Persians themselves were involved with building the second temple, and the Romans came and destroyed it, don't you think then the Persians are going to now destroy the Romans for destroying the temple that they were involved in building, right? If they destroyed the nation that destroyed a temple that they weren't even involved in, all the more so they're going to destroy this nation that destroyed the temple they were involved in. And therefore, that's what's going to be. Okay, so there's a kal v'chomer. Again, one could obviously argue with this kal v'chomer. Which nation destroys which nation isn't always dependent on what their motivation is. It also depends on what their capabilities are, whether they were strong enough to overpower the Romans. That's a whole different story. But he's taking tools at our disposal, like kal v'chomers, to learn about this. Here comes our other opinion. Amarav, Atida Paras shetipol biyad Romi. The Romans are going to destroy the Persians. Amrule Rav Kahana v'Rav Asi. The Rav, he doesn't really say why. Okay, so Rav Kahana says and Rav Asi say to Rav, Banoye beyad satore, the builders are going to fall into the hands of those who destroy. In other words, they helped us build it. How is it in the end that they're going to be destroyed? Amar lehu in gzerat hamelechi. He says very simply, yes, you might say it sounds odd, but this is what God decreed. Forget about what I said before. Who has more power and who's going to be able to? No, according to Rav, it's all a decree from God. God's the one who decides who's going to destroy who, and he's decided. Now, it's unclear how Rav knows what God decided, but he says it's a gzerat hamelech that the Romans are going to destroy the Persians. We'll finally see at the very end of the sugya where it seems like he gets it from, even though he doesn't say it directly. Amar iked amre, some people say, Amar inu nami hakasat lebeknishta. Some people say that what he said was, no, it's not because they helped us build the temple and that's going to save them. And no. The Romans are going to destroy them even though they helped us build the temple. And that's because these people are no good nicks either. The Persians right now are destroying our shuls, our Beit Knista, which is sometimes means shuls, sometimes means just gathering places. They're destroying our gathering places, and therefore they're worthy of being destroyed by the Romans. In other words, it's true they helped us then, but they're not really helping us now. Tanya Namihache, there's a brighter to support both these readings. Atida parasha tipol b'yad Romi. One is because they're destroying our gathering places. Okay, and it's a gzerat hamelech that this is going to happen, that the builders are going to actually fall in the hands of those who destroy. Ta'amar Rav Yehuda Amarav, ein ben David ba ad shetifshot malchut Romi harasha'a b'chol ha'olam kulo tisha chodashim. In other words, now here's a reason, and maybe this is why they say gzerat hamelech, because it was known that first the Romans have to rule the entire world for 9 months, and only after that will the Davidic dynasty return. The kingdom will return to the house of David, right? Which means basically the Mashiach will come. Which means if the Romans have to rule, then the Romans are going to have to wipe out the Persians at some point. Shene'emar, as it says, how do we know this 9 months? And this sounds like 9 months of birth, and that's what we're going to see from the pasuk. Lachen yitnem ad et yoleda yalada, right? Until the time when someone gives birth, meaning 9 months, the yeter achav yishuvun al bnei Israel. Right? And God will put them in charge for those 9 months, and then we'll go back, right? Then the rest of the brothers will come back, and that's a sign that the Davidic dynasty will be returned. Before we finish this, because this is the end of that section, I want to point out one Gemara that comes up in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, which talks about the fact that the Persians, it's true they helped us build the first temple, but in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, it says they built it with wood so that if they needed to destroy it, they'd be able to destroy it very easily. And they say because of that, they were partially responsible for the destruction. And that might be a different reason as to why they're going to, in the end, get punished by the Romans, because they helped us, but, they helped us in a particular way, which was somewhat helpful, but in the end, it made it very easy to destroy. You wonder why they didn't bring up that Gemara here. It's a good question. Okay, that's the end of this whole section of the Persians. Now we're going back to our topic. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, now we're going to talk about laws of mezuzah, and Daf Mishalahem this week of Shiur and Chamutal is all about laws of mezuzah. If you want to know basics, Aleph, A to Z on mezuzah, when you're obligated mezuzah, when you're not, all different issues relating to mezuzah. You can listen to Daf Mishalahem this week if your Hebrew's good. So here goes. All the lishakot in the temple, all these different rooms didn't have mezuzahs on them. Okay, why didn't they have mezuzahs? Because people didn't live there, except for chutz milishkat paredrin, shayaba beitira lekohen gadol. For 7 days a year, the kohen gadol lived in the lishkat paredrin. Because of that, it had to have a mezuzah on it because he was living there. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, v'halo kama lishakot hayu b'mikdash shaya lem beitira v'lo haya lem mezuzah. What are you talking about? There were a bunch of other rooms where Kohanim would sleep. Right? They would go in and wake them up. If you learned at the end, when we learned the Masechtot that have to do with things that go on in the temple, Masechet Tamid and Midot, and we talked about how people would go in, there was someone in charge of waking everybody up, and they were sleeping in certain rooms in the temple. So what do you mean? Other rooms were used for sleeping also. And they didn't have a mezuzah. Says, no, really, you don't need a mezuzah in this kaparadrin either. The reason why it has a mezuzah is because of Gzera, which we're only going to get to. The last line of today's daf will be what the reason for the Gzera is. Okay, keep you staying till the end of Shiur today. So, question is, this didn't have, right? Now, first of all, what's the issue here? When are you chayav a mezuzah? When are you not chayav a mezuzah? First of all, there's a big debate among the Rishonim, which might come as a surprise, whether or not you have to put a mezuzah up in a place where you rent. Okay, this isn't even renting. Forget about that, right? So nor we hold that you have to, if you rent a house or an apartment, you have to put up mezuzahs. But apparently there's a machloket about it, about whether you really need to or not, right? How that all fits in with this, if you say you don't need to, why would you even think that the Kohen Gadol would have to put a mezuzah, right? We'd have to put a mezuzah on a room where he's certainly not the owner, he's not even renting, right? Why would Chachamim actually say that you need to? So it's an interesting question. Anyway, there's just food for thought. And I wanted you to know that there is this opinion, even though we don't hold that way, that there are Rishonim who hold that if you're renting, you don't have an obligation of mezuzah. But again, we definitely don't hold that way. And like I said, you could listen to Shiur and Chamutal, they go into some of the halachas. So now we're going to try to explain. My Tamid Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabba Kasavar Rabbi Yehuda, Kol Bayit She'en Asui Limot HaChamar Limot HaGshamim Eino Bayit. If you have a house that's not meant for living in both the summer and the winter, then you're not obligated to mezuzah. Now, you might be thinking, oh, I have a summer house, right? Well, I don't need a mezuzah there. So that's what it sounds like right now. But Abaye has a question. He says, but wait, Haktiv, v'keti beit hachoref al beit hakayitz. In Sefer Amos, he goes out against these wealthy people who have summer homes and winter homes. And he says to them, I'm going to destroy your winter homes and I'm going to destroy your summer homes. And notice it calls them homes. They are homes. If they're homes, then they need mezuzah. So here it seems to imply you do need a mezuzah even if you only live there in the summer or the winter. So Amarle, Beit Choref u Beit Kayitz Ikre. Bayit Stama lo Ikre. He says, okay, I'm going to distinguish. If you have a summer home and you call it my summer home and you only live there in the summer, that's your summer home. If you live there all summer, it's your home for the summer. You have to put a mezuzah. But if it's a home and you happen to only live there a short amount of time and you don't live there all year round, and you just call it my house, that's not a house and you're not obligated in mezuzah, at least according to the Gemara. Okay, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you really didn't need a mezuzah in this room that you need for 7 days. Well, now we're going to bring a contradiction. It's really going to be a contradiction, not only on Rabbi Yehuda, but also on Chachamim. And I see in the chat, there's an issue raised about Sukkah. Here comes the issue of Sukkah. Sukkah chag b'chag. Okay, exactly what you're saying in the chat. Sukkah on Sukkot. Here you have a house that's temporary, right? But it's your house for those 7 days. Does it need a mezuzah or not? So interestingly, Rabbi Yehuda, who's the one who says you're not obligated to mezuzah on lishkat paredrin, what does he say? Mechayev. You're obligated. We're going to see. We don't yet know we're talking about mezuzah, but in a minute we'll see we're talking about mezuzah and 2 other halachot. The chachamim potrim. The chachamim exempt you, which is very strange because the rabbi said when it comes to lishkat paredrin, you're obligated, and here it says you're not obligated. So that's weird. Seems to be a total contradiction. V'tanei alan, it was said about this source. Rabbi Yehuda mechayev be'eruv u'bemezuzah u'bemaser. You're chayev in 3 things mezuzah. Number 1, you need an eruv chatzero to allow you to carry. Number 2, you need a mezuzah to allow you, right, because it's your house. And number 3, you're obligated in maser. What does that mean? It means in order to be obligated to tithe your produce, if you're still outside in the fields, you're not obligated. When you bring it, right, then you put it in the pile and then you bring it into your house. It needs to be brought into your house to be obligated in maser. If you didn't bring it into your house, then you're not obligated. What if you brought it into your sukkah? Is that considered your house? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, yes, it is. So now we want to say, maybe just like Rabbi Yehuda said, you did need a mezuzah in lishkat paredrin, it's just it was only rabbinic in nature. So maybe the same thing here. Maybe you only need a mezuzah on your sukkah midrabbanan, and then Rabbi Yehuda doesn't contradict himself. Well, bishlama eruv mezuzah yikalamemer midrabbanan. It makes sense to say the rabbi's obligated you mezuzah, they're obligating you an eruv. Okay, I could get that. But elamaser miikalamemer midrabbanan. You can't say that they said maser on a rabbinic level. We're going to obligate you a maser. Why not? This is a classic example of if you're going to be stringent. Sometimes your stringency leads to problems. How so? Well, remember, we've seen this concept before, which is that you can't take You can't tithe your produce by using some that are exempt from Maaser at a Torah level and some that are obligated in Maaser on a Torah level. So if you have, for example, certain things that are obligated in Maaser, let's say you have lemons that are growing in a way that I'm trying to think of what would be Rabbanit, but somehow you have a case of Maaser Rabbanit, like this case. They didn't come into your house yet. And you want to take Maaser from them on the stuff that's in your house. Now, they're not in your house yet. They're actually not obligated on rabbinic law either, but it would have to be some case where you're obligated in some of them on rabbinic law and some on Torah law. And what you do is you put them in a big pile together, they're not even in a pile. You take one and you say, this is for all of them. You can't do that. You can't mix ones that are obligated and ones that aren't obligated. Therefore, what does he say? Well, if you can't do that, then if you say, I brought fruits into my sukkah, you're going to be obligated to tithe them, and you're only obligated on a rabbinic level, that could create a huge problem. Because people don't distinguish between what's rabbinic and what's Torah law, and they won't realize that these are on a different level than the other ones that you have in your house. And then you'll end up accidentally totally messing up your produce because you're going to do Truma and Masra in a way that they don't work. Because you're going to take from the Patur al Chiyuv and from the Chiyuv al Patur, you're going to mix them up and you won't know the difference. And that will be a problem because that won't work. So therefore, it doesn't make sense to say that Rabbi Yehuda obligated on rabbinic law, this mezuzah, eruv, and maaser in your sukkah. So therefore, it must be Torah law, in which case we're back to square one. We don't have a good solution to why there's a contradiction. Right now, they're focusing on the contradiction in the words of Rabbi Yehuda. So the next section you can really only understand if you focus specifically on Rabbi Yehuda and not the contradiction between the rabbis. Soon we'll get to that also. But Ela Amar Abai, Abai is going to suggest, although we're going to reject it because it really doesn't make sense, particularly in light of the Chachamim, but he's going to suggest the following. Beshiva, in the 7 days of both Chag Sukkot and of the Lishkat Paredrin, Kule Amalo Pligi de Mechayv. Okay, and let's just focus on Rabbi Yehuda now, otherwise it really doesn't make much sense. Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis both agree that on the 7 days that the Kohen Gadol is there and on the 7 days that you're in your sukkah, it's the holiday, for sure you have to put up a mezuzah. Ki pligi b'shar yamot hashana. So now the machlokah becomes, what about the other days of the year? Rabbanan Savrei, Gazlina and Shar Yamot Hashana Atu Shiva. The rabbis say, listen, you needed those 7 days, so let's just make you obligated the whole time. And Rabbi Yehuda, right, also in Sukkah and also in Lishkat Paredrin, okay, it's a little bit problematic and you'll see it, because the rabbi said you're actually exempt from mezuzah in Sukkah. So that's why this doesn't really make any sense. But let's just stick with it right now anyway. Let's say he's talking about Lishkat Paredrin. In Lishkat Paredrin, you need it all year because we want to make sure you have it there those 7 days. So make sure you have it all year, so you don't end up, forgetting to put up the mezuzah when the Kohen Gadol comes. But Rabbi Yehuda Savar Lo Gazlina, and he says, we're not worried that if you don't put up your mezuzah the rest of the year, you're going to forget to put it up when the Kohen Gadol comes to live there. Of course, you're going to remember to put it up, and therefore you don't need a mezuzah all the days of the year, but you do need it for those 7 days. Well, Ela Amar Rava, Amar Le Rava, Rava says, Vaha Sukkot Chag B'Chag Katani. You can't possibly say that the machloka between them on Sukkot has to do with the rest of the year because it says Sukkot Chag B'Chag. It specifically says the machloket is on Sukkot. So clearly that's when they debate it. And also you have another issue, which is the rabbis, they're exempted and it doesn't really make any sense. So therefore, Ela Amar Rava, Rava says, no, this is the explanation. It's the same logic, but we're going to take it one step the other way, which is, yes, we're going to distinguish between 7 days and the rest of the year, but we're going to say the following. Everyone agrees, both in Sukkah and in Lishkat Paredrin, that you don't need mezuzah the rest of the year. Only when you're living in the Sukkah for those 7 days, let's say you leave your Sukkah up a month before or a few days before, you don't need a mezuzah there. If Lishkat Paredrin doesn't need the rest of the year, that everybody agrees. Ki pligi b'shiva, their machloket though, as it says, right, Sukkot Chag B'Chag, that's when they have a machloket in the 7 days. Now, the problem is that they crisscross, right? Again, if you look at the chart, it's very easy to see that I made on the sheet, right? You have the Rabbi Yehuda says you're exempt in Lishkat Paredrin. It's just there's a gzera. So from Torah law, you don't need only it's a gzera. Whereas the rabbis say you're obligated. And when it comes to Sukkah, it's the reverse. Rabbi Yehuda says you're obligated, and the Chachamim say you're not obligated at all. So sukkah tam alachud, vilishkat tam alachud. They're each based on a different logic. How so? What's the logic? Sukkah tam alachud, Rabbi Yehuda. So what's the reason for sukkah? Rabbi Yehuda l'tame. Rabbi Yehuda goes according to his shita. And there's a very famous machloket we're going to see when we get to sukkah. Da'amar sukkah dirat keva be'inan. Your sukkah has to be a permanent dwelling for those 7 days. Well, if you're going to call it a permanent dwelling, then you're obviously mechayva b'mezuzah. If it's your permanent dwelling, you need a mezuzah there. The Rabbanan l'tamayu, and the rabbis disagree with him in sukkah and say, da'amare sukkah dirat arai be'inan. It's just a temporary dwelling. You don't need to make it your bayit keva. It's just arai. It's temporary, and therefore lo mechayva b'mezuzah. So that perfect logic, right? It fits perfectly with their approaches. Lishka tam alachud. When it comes to lishka paradrin, it's based on a different machloket. Rabbanan savre. Now here it doesn't say l'ta'amayu because we don't know that they have a debate about this, but we're going to assume that this must be their debate. Dira ba'al korcha shma dira. According to the rabbis, if you're forced to live somewhere, you don't necessarily want to live there. You think the Kohen Gadol wants to leave his house for those 7 days and live in the Beit HaMikdash? I'm sure he'd rather be home, right? But he's forced to live there. He has no choice. If you're forced to live somewhere, that's still called you're living there. Whether or not you want to live there or you don't want to live there, that's called living. So because of that, right, he's going to say it's a dira, the rabbis, and therefore you're obligated mezuzah. The Rabbi Yehuda savar dira ba'al korcha lo shma dira. If you're forced to live somewhere, that's not considered living, and therefore you don't need a mezuzah. But what did he say again? Now I told you we get back to this, the last line of today's daf. However, despite the fact that you're not obligated mezuzah in lishkat paradrim because the Kohen is there against his will, the problem is if you're going to view this as the Kohen is there against his will, there's another problem, which is so midrabanan they institute that you put a mezuzah there. Shelo yomul kohen gadol chavush bebeit hasurim. We don't want it to look like you're putting him in prison for those 7 days and you're forcing him, right? It's true he's forced to go there, but you don't want it to appear that he's forced to live there. Right? I'll end today's off with a question like yesterday, which is, what are we talking about? Why would anyone think that the Kohen Gadol is forced to live there, right? On one hand, you could say maybe they want to make it homey, right? They want to make it feel like you're living here and therefore put a mezuzah on. But this idea about saying that a Kohen Gadol is, right, we might think he's in prison. So the only thing I could think of, I didn't really research where we get this idea, but I was thinking this idea of the Prushim and the Tzdukim and how we're going to get to this scene, as I mentioned earlier already, about the Kohen Gadol starts crying because they accuse him. And there's this whole issue of those 7 days besides he's supposed to focus and besides supposed to separate from his wife so he doesn't become what we call a Bo'el Nida. But there's also this element that they want to teach him all the halachot because they want him to know all the halachot according to the Prushi way, right? To make sure he's not at Stuki or he's not going to do it the way that Stukim do it. And because of that, I think that they wanted to make sure that there's this appearance anyway, even though maybe it really is that he's forced to be here, but they don't want it to look that way because that doesn't look, right? It doesn't look very positive. They want it to appear that he's not jailed here, but that he's here on his own free will and he's coming to learn the halachot in a positive way. And this goes back to also the Kohanim Gedolim were corrupt, as we talked about. So maybe because of that, there was this concern that it would feel like and it would look like we're imprisoning him so that we make sure, because, imagine in the Second Temple, end of the Second Temple period, when there's all this corruption and he's the main person getting atonement for all the nation, right? And they're nervous about it. So yeah, they are kind of jailing him in order to make sure that he does things properly, but they don't want it to appear that way because that doesn't look very good, not for a religion, not for the avoda, not for anything. Right? They don't want it to be like he's forced into this at all. And therefore they put him as a very interesting thought. Can think about that, ponder it throughout the day, and have a good day, everyone. We'll stop here.